The house was unusually quiet, save for the gentle hum of the vacuum cleaner and the occasional rustle of paper as I tidied up the living room. With everyone gone for the weekend, I finally had the opportunity to put things in order without interruptions. My parents were visiting relatives, and my stepbrother Alex had opted to stay behind, claiming he had schoolwork to catch up on. Though it wasn't unusual for us to be alone in the house, today felt different. There was a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the odd feeling in my chest, a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Shaking off the thought, I adjusted the throw pillows on the couch and moved toward the kitchen, mentally listing what needed to be done next. Jess, Alex's voice startled me, breaking through the quiet. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his tall frame leaning casually against the doorframe. His dark hair was tousled, and there was an uncharacteristically soft expression on his face. "You've been at this for hours. Don't you ever take a break?" I rolled my eyes and smiled, brushing my hands against my apron. Someone has to clean up around here, and unless you've suddenly developed a passion for housekeeping, it's not going to be you. He smirked, stepping into the room. Fair point. But you don't have to do everything in one day, you know? I shrugged, busying myself with stacking a pile of stray magazines. Might as well while it's quiet. Oh, Alex lingered, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It's kind of weird being here without them. It's too quiet. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. Yeah, I guess. There was a moment of silence, and I felt his eyes on me, intense and probing. Do you ever feel like, like we don't really fit in this family? He asked suddenly. I paused, the question catching me off guard. What do you mean? Alex shrugged, leaning against the counter. I mean, they're always so busy with their own lives, it's like we're just there, you and me, filling space. The weight of his words hung in the air. It wasn't the first time I'd felt something similar, but hearing him say it out loud felt almost dangerous, vulnerable. I guess I never thought about it like that, I said carefully, resuming my tidying. But I can see what you mean. He gave a small, humorless laugh. It's just nice to talk to someone who gets it, you know? I looked up at him. His expression softer than I'd ever seen it. There was something raw in his gaze, something that made my stomach flutter. I pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. Well, I'm here, I said lightly, trying to ease the tension. So if you ever need to vent about their quirks or how much you hate cleaning, you know where to find me. Alex smiled, the corner of his mouth quirking up in a way that sent an inexplicable shiver down my spine. Thanks, Jess. I turned away quickly, hoping he didn't notice the sudden warmth creeping up my neck. The moment passed, and he wandered back upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I moved to the dining room, I couldn't help but replay the conversation in my head. Alex and I had never been particularly close, not since our parents had remarried 5 years ago. He was always the reserved, brooding type, and I was the one who tried to keep the peace. But lately, there had been a shift. Subtle things. The way his gaze lingered a little too long. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. I'd chalked it up to my imagination, but now I wasn't so sure. I shook my head, scolding myself. Don't be ridiculous, I muttered under my breath, setting the table for dinner even though I knew it wouldn't be used tonight. A little later, while scrubbing the kitchen counters, I heard Alex's footsteps on the stairs. They were deliberate, unhurried, like he was deep in thought. He appeared in the doorway again, leaning against the frame as though he couldn't keep away. "What's next on your cleaning rampage?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. I smirked, tossing the sponge into the sink. "Probably the floors. Why? Are you volunteering to help?" Alex raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a smile. "Sure. What do you need me to do?" I blinked, momentarily stunned. "Alex? Volunteering to clean?" That was new. "Well, you could start by vacuuming the living room," I said, testing him. "If you're serious." "Consider it done," he said, pushing off the doorframe and heading toward the vacuum. I watched him go, a strange mix of amusement and curiosity bubbling up inside me. Maybe he was just bored. Or maybe... No, I wasn't going to let my mind wander there. Underscore, 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 underscore. About an hour later, we found ourselves working side by side in the dining room. I was wiping down the table while Alex rearranged the chairs. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over everything. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was an easy rhythm between us, a sense of unspoken understanding. "You're not so bad at this," I teased, glancing at him as he adjusted a chair. He grinned, his dimples showing. "Don't let it go to your head. This is a one-time thing." "Noted," I said with a laugh. There was a beat of silence, and then he spoke again, his tone more serious. "You know, I don't say it enough, but I appreciate you, Jess. Everything you do." I looked up, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "That's sweet of you to say," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He held my gaze for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "I mean it." My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away, focusing on the table. "Well, I appreciate you too," I said softly. The air between us felt charged, electric. I could feel him watching me, his presence a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. "You're something else, you know that?" he said, his voice low. I didn't trust myself to look at him. "You're not so bad yourself," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was just the wind, I realized, but the spell had been broken. I let out a shaky breath, grateful for the interruption. Alex chuckled, the tension easing as he stepped back. "I'll finish up here. Go take a break." I nodded, grateful for the excuse to step away and collect myself. As I walked toward the living room, I couldn't help but wonder what had just happened and what it meant for us moving forward. And by the time I stepped back into the kitchen, the atmosphere between Alex and me had shifted yet again. The air felt heavier, as though something unsaid lingered just beneath the surface. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my task, but Alex wasn't making it easy. "Are you sure you don't need help with anything else?" he asked, leaning against the counter with a disarming smile. His tone was casual, but there was something about the way his eyes lingered on me that made my pulse quicken. I waved him off, pretending not to notice. "I think you've done your good deed for the day. Go relax." He didn't move. Instead, he reached over and picked up the sponge I'd left on the counter, tossing it from hand to hand like he was testing its weight. "Relaxing's overrated," he said with a shrug. "Besides, it's kind of fun watching you work." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the flush that crept up my neck. "Don't you have schoolwork to do?" "Later," he replied smoothly. "Right now, this is more interesting." I tried to focus on scrubbing the stove, but I was hyper aware of his presence just a few feet away. His cologne, subtle but unmistakable, seemed to wrap around me, making it impossible to concentrate. "Alex," I said finally, turning to face him, "what's going on with you today?" He raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What do you mean?" "You're being different," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Helpful, chatty. It's not like you." He smirked, stepping closer. "Maybe I'm just in a good mood." I crossed my arms, trying to put some distance between us. "Okay, but why? Did something happen?" His expression softened, and for a moment I thought he might actually answer, but instead he just shrugged again, his gaze flickering to the floor. "I guess I just like spending time with you," he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. I looked away, pretending to fuss with a dish towel, but my heart was pounding in my chest. "Jess," he said, his voice low and steady, "can I ask you something?" I hesitated, then nodded, still not looking at him. "Do you ever wonder if things could have been different? Between us, I mean?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to acknowledge the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks, months, maybe even years. My mind raced, searching for the right response, but all I could manage was a shaky, "What do you mean?" He took another step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "I mean, if we weren't step-siblings, if things were different." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My throat was dry, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and intrigue. "Alex, I don't think—" "I know it's wrong," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you." My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, bumping into the counter behind me. "You can't say things like that," I said, my voice shaking. "How do we not?" he asked, his tone more determined now. "It's the truth." "Because uh, it's not right," I stammered, my cheeks burning. He reached out, his hand brushing mine in the faintest of touches, and I felt a spark that was impossible to ignore. "Doesn't it feel right to you?" he asked softly. I couldn't answer. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at him, my mind and body at war with each other. Every rational part of me was screaming to put an end to this, to walk away and pretend it never happened. But there was another part, a darker, more dangerous part, that wanted to stay. "I can't," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Alex stepped back, giving me just enough space to breathe again. His expression was a mix of regret and longing, and for a moment I thought he might apologize. But instead, he said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Uh, It's fine. Let's just forget about it, okay?" He didn't respond. He just turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I spent the next hour cleaning furiously, trying to scrub away the memory of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Alex had looked at me, the way his words had made me feel. It was wrong, I knew that, but it didn't make it any less real. Eventually, I found myself in the living room, vacuuming the rug for the second time, just to keep myself busy. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't notice Alex standing in the doorway until he spoke. Jazz. I turned to face him, my heart sinking at the serious expression on his face. What is it? I just wanted to say, I'm not sorry for what I said, he admitted, his voice steady. I meant it. All of it. Alex, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted. I just needed you to know. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He watched me for a moment longer, then turned and walked upstairs, leaving me alone once again. I sank onto the couch, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to think or how to feel. All I knew was that something between us had changed, and there was no going back. For the rest of the evening, the house was eerily quiet. Alex had retreated to his room, and I had stayed downstairs, trying to lose myself in the endless tasks of cleaning. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, the memory of his words clung to me like a shadow. When I finally forced myself to sit down, exhaustion washing over me, I found my mind wandering back to the look in his eyes, the way he'd spoken with such raw honesty. A part of me wanted to dismiss it as a fleeting moment of weakness, something we could both laugh about and move on from, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had shifted between us, and it wasn't going away. The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted me out of my thoughts. Alex appeared in the doorway, his expression guarded. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the room. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stiffened, my pulse quickening. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," he said, his voice softer now. I need to get this off my chest." I wanted to say no, to tell him to go back upstairs and leave me alone, but the pleading look in his eyes made it impossible to refuse. I nodded reluctantly, motioning for him to sit on the couch across from me. He didn't sit. Instead, he paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "I know what I said earlier was out of line," he began, "and I don't blame you if you hate me for it, but I can't pretend it's not how I feel." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Alex, we can't. This isn't something we can just talk about like it's normal." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's not normal, but I can't help how I feel. I've tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it's always there, and I think you feel it too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I didn't know what I felt anymore. All I knew was that his presence was like a magnet, pulling me in no matter how much I resisted. "Oh, I didn't feel something," my voice trembling. Even if I did feel something, which I'm not saying I do, it doesn't matter. It's wrong. "Well," he asked, his voice rising with frustration. "Well, because someone decided to marry our parents, that doesn't change who we are. It doesn't change what we feel." "It changes everything," I insisted, standing up. "Do you have any idea what people would think if they found out? What it would do to our family?" "I don't care what people think," he shot back. "And I don't think you do either. You're just scared." His words struck a nerve, and I glared at him. "Of course I'm scared, Alex. This isn't just about us. There are consequences to this, real, serious consequences." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "I know, and I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. I need to know if I'm crazy for thinking there's something here. Because if I am, I'll drop it. I'll leave you alone. But if I'm not..." His voice trailed off, and the silence between us was deafening. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his emotions pressing down on me. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a tangled mess. "I don't know," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't know what I feel." Hmm. Mm. Alex reached out, his hand brushing mine. It was such a small, simple gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I looked up at him, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear, the hope, the longing. "You don't have to figure it out right now," he said gently. I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." I pulled my hand away, stepping back. "I can't do this, Alex. I can't." He didn't try to stop me. He just nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay," he said quietly. "I understand." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my heart heavy with a mix of emotions I couldn't begin to unravel. I spent the next few hours locked in my bedroom, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how much I analyzed it, I couldn't come to any conclusions. All I knew was that Alex's words had awakened something in me, something I wasn't ready to confront. When I finally emerged, it was late, the house was dark and still, and I assumed Alex had gone to bed. But as I passed by the living room, I saw him sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as I approached, his eyes red and tired. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. I shook my head, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken words, and I could feel the weight of his presence like a physical force. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice breaking. "For everything. I never wanted to make things harder for you." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I know, and I'm sorry too." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I meant what I said earlier. I won't push you. I hope you'll think about it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, staring at the shadows on the wall, wondering how we had gotten to this point and where we would go from here. The next day, I woke up hoping the weight of last night would somehow dissipate. But as soon as I stepped into the quiet kitchen, the memories came rushing back. The way Alex had looked at me, the way his words had struck chords I didn't know existed. It was all too much. I needed clarity, but clarity felt impossible in this house, with him. The morning dragged on. I busied myself with menial tasks, trying to focus on anything other than the swirling chaos in my mind. But every creak of the stairs or shadow passing by the doorway set my nerves on edge. I couldn't avoid him forever. "Morning," Alex said, his voice softer than usual as he appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in a casual hoodie and jeans, his hair tousled in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes on the counter as I poured myself a cup of coffee. He lingered as if waiting for an invitation to speak. When I didn't offer one, he stepped closer. "Jez, about last night?" "Let's not," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I can't go there again." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Okay, but can we at least talk? Just normally?" I hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. Coffee?" "Sure," he said, sliding into a seat at the kitchen island. I handed him a mug and sat across from him, keeping as much space between us as possible. For a while, we sipped our coffee in silence. It was almost peaceful, but the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. Finally, Alex broke the quiet. "You know, I've always admired how you can hold everything together," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Even when things get messy, it's like you have this inner strength that I can't figure out." I glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "That's not true," I said, shaking my head. "If anything, I'm barely holding it together most of the time." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "You don't give yourself enough credit. You've always been the glue holding this family together." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat, as his gaze was so intense, so full of something I couldn't name, that it left me speechless. Before I could think of what to say, Alex reached out and covered my hand with his. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, and I froze, torn between pulling away and staying rooted in the moment. "Jess," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't pretend this doesn't mean something." I pulled my hand away, my heart racing. "Alex, we've already talked about this. We can't—" "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "but it doesn't stop me from feeling it." His vulnerability cut through my defenses, and for a moment I let myself feel the weight of his words. There was a part of me that wanted to give in, to let go of all the rules and boundaries and just feel. But the rational part of me, the part that knew how wrong this was, refused to budge. I need some air," I said abruptly, standing up and grabbing my coat. "I'll be back later." The cold air outside was a welcome relief from the stifling tension inside the house. I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, my thoughts a tangled mess. How had things gotten so complicated? And why couldn't I just shut down these feelings, these confusing, dangerous feelings? When I returned home, the house was quiet. I assumed Alex had gone out or retreated to his room, and for a moment I felt relieved. But as I stepped into the living room, I found him sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. "You're back," he said, looking up as I entered. "Yeah," I replied, setting my coat on the chair. "Needed to clear my head." "Did it help?" he asked, his tone cautious. I shook my head, sinking into the chair across from him. "Not really." He studied me for a moment, his expression pained. "Jess, I meant what I said earlier. I don't want to make this harder for you, but I also don't want to lie to myself anymore." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not just about you, Alex. This is about both of us and our family. What happens if—" "We don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, cutting me off gently. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions. I need you to know how I feel." I sighed, my heart aching with the weight of it all. "This isn't fair," I said finally. "None of this is fair." "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But life isn't fair, Jess. You taught me that." His words brought a sad smile to my lips, and for a moment the tension eased, but the underlying question, "What do we do now?" remained unanswered. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day's events over and over in my mind. Alex's words, his touch, the way he looked at me. It was all too much. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding this, but the thought of confronting it head-on terrified me. I didn't know what the future held or how we would navigate this impossible situation. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with unspoken words. Alex and I tiptoed around each other, exchanging only brief, polite acknowledgments. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as a distraction, while Alex sat at the dining table scrolling through his phone. The tension between us was palpable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it boiled over. As I set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, he looked up with a tentative smile. "Thanks." I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "No problem." We ate in silence, the clinking of utensils on plates the only sound in the room. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, but I didn't dare look up. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. After breakfast, I retreated to the living room, hoping to lose myself in the comfort of a book. But Alex followed me, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. I could feel the weight of his presence, and it was impossible to concentrate. "Jess," he said finally, breaking the silence, "we need to talk." I sighed, setting the book aside. "Alex, I don't think there's anything left to say." "There is," he insisted, leaning forward. "You can't keep running from this, from us." I flinched at the word, my chest tightening. "There is no us, Alex. There can't be." "But there is," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Whether you want to admit it or not, there's something between us, something real." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "It doesn't matter if it's real. It doesn't change the fact that it's wrong." Does it have to be wrong?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "We're not hurting anyone. We're adults. Why can't we just—" "Because it's not just about us," I interrupted, my voice cracking. "It's about our family. What do you think Mom and Dad would say if they found out? What would our friends think? Our neighbors? This isn't some harmless secret, Alex. It has consequences." His face fell, and for a moment, he looked like a wounded animal. "So that's it? You're more worried about what other people think than how you feel?" "It's not that simple," I said, my voice softening. "I care about you, Alex. I do. But this, whatever this is, it can't happen." He stared at me, his eyes searching mine for a glimmer of hope. When he didn't find it, he nodded slowly, the fight draining out of him. "I get it," he said quietly. "I'll back off. I just—" "Just tell me if you need anything. I need help. Are you praying?" I watched as he stood and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. My heart ached, but I knew I'd made the right decision, or at least I hoped I had. Later that afternoon, our parents returned home. The sound of their laughter and chatter filled the house, a stark contrast to the tension that had consumed it for the past 2 days. I plastered on a smile, greeting them with hugs and small talk, but inside I was a mess. As we sat down for dinner, I couldn't help but feel hyper-aware of Alex. He was quieter than usual, answering questions with curt replies and avoiding eye contact. Our parents didn't seem to notice, but I could feel the strain radiating off him. "So, how was your weekend?" Mom asked, glancing between the two of us. "You two didn't kill each other, did you?" I forced a laugh. "No, it was fine. Quiet." "Alex?" Dad prompted, raising an eyebrow. "Anything to add?" Alex shrugged, stabbing at his food. "It was fine." Mom and Dad exchanged a look but didn't press further. I kept my head down, focusing on my plate, and prayed the conversation would move on. But as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mom was watching me. Her gaze lingered a little too long, her questions a little too pointed. It was as if she could sense that something was off, even if she didn't know what it was. When dinner was over, I offered to clean up, eager for an excuse to escape. But as I stood at the sink, scrubbing plates, Mom appeared beside me, drying a dish. "Everything okay, sweetie?" she asked, her tone casual but laced with concern. "Yeah, of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowing. "I don't know. You just seem distracted." "I'm fine," I insisted, turning back to the sink. "Just tired, I guess." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. "Well, if you ever want to talk, you know I'm here." "Thanks, Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the day's events in my head. The look on Alex's face when I'd shut him down, the subtle suspicion in Mom's eyes. It was all too much. I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a knife, one misstep away from disaster. But despite my fear, I couldn't deny the truth. There was something between Alex and me, something I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. And as much as I wanted to believe I'd made the right choice, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, what if I hadn't? The house was quiet again that night, the muffled hum of the dishwasher the only sound breaking the stillness. Everyone else had gone to bed, but sleep felt impossible. I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television, my thoughts tangled and heavy. The soft creak of the stairs pulled me from my reverie. I turned to see Alex descending, his silhouette illuminated by the dim light from the kitchen. His steps were slow and hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether to continue. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, stopping at the bottom of the stairs. "Neither could you, I guess." I managed a faint smile. "No, too much on my mind." He hesitated for a moment, then walked into the room, sitting down on the far end of the couch. There was a safe distance between us, but the tension was still there, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "Jess," he began, his voice cautious, "I know you don't want to talk about this anymore, but I need to say one last thing." I looked at him, my chest tightening. "Alex, please," he said, cutting me off gently. "Just hear me out, and then I'll leave it alone, I promise." I nodded, reluctantly, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. "I don't regret telling you how I feel," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor, "even if it made things harder, even if it ruined everything. I needed you to know." I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. "You didn't ruin anything, Alex. It's just complicated." He nodded, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it is. But I don't think that changes the fact that there's something here, something we can't ignore." I looked away, my throat tightening. "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "But I don't think pretending it doesn't exist is the answer either." The words hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I didn't know what to say, because part of me agreed with him. After a long silence, Alex stood up, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I should go," he said quietly. "Good night, Jess." "Good night," I replied, my voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, as though he wanted to say more, but then he turned and walked away, disappearing up the stairs. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he'd been, my thoughts a chaotic mess. The next morning, I woke up feeling no closer to clarity. Alex was already gone, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter. Went out for a while. Don't wait up for me. I stared at the note for a long time, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I spent the day trying to distract myself, throwing myself into chores and errands, but nothing could quiet the storm inside me. By the time evening rolled around, I was emotionally and physically drained. When Alex finally returned, it was late. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale, but he managed a small smile when he saw me sitting at the dining table. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "You're still up." I nodded, watching him carefully. I wanted to make sure you got home okay. "Thanks," he said, sitting down across from me. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "Me too," I admitted, my stomach twisting. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Jess, I really don't. So, if you want me to back off completely, I will. I'll figure out a way to deal with this, whatever it is. I just want you to be okay." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The idea of him stepping back, of us pretending none of this had ever happened, filled me with an ache I couldn't explain. "Alex," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't know what the right thing to do is. I really don't. But I don't want to lose you. Not like this." "You won't lose me," he said quickly. "No matter what, I promise." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "Thank you." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over mine for a moment before pulling back. "We'll figure this out, one way or another." The weight of his words settled over me, heavy but oddly comforting. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Fragile and uncertain, but real. The following days passed in a blur, the tension between us slowly easing but never completely disappearing. We found a new rhythm, one that felt tentative and unsteady but bearable. We didn't talk about what had happened, but the unspoken understanding lingered, a quiet thread connecting us. Late one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the road ahead. I didn't know where it would lead, or how we would navigate the tangled web of emotions and consequences. But one thing was certain: things would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. As I lay in bed that night, the house wrapped in silence, my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Every conversation, every lingering glance, every unspoken word between Alex and me played on repeat in my mind. The weight of what we were tangled in was almost unbearable, but beneath the guilt and fear, there was something else, something I couldn't ignore, a pull, a longing, a connection I didn't want to admit existed. I knew the world would judge us harshly. They'd call it wrong, forbidden, and perhaps they'd be right, but the truth was never that simple. I couldn't undo the feelings that had grown between us, nor could I pretend that they weren't there. I didn't know if I was strong enough to face what might come next, but I couldn't turn my back on it either. Maybe we were doomed to fail, or maybe we'd find a way to make sense of it all. All I knew was that Alex had seen me, really seen me, in a way no one else ever had. And no matter what, that would always mean something. For now, I would carry the weight of our secret, unsure of where the path would lead, but unable to turn away.